We're not going to do it.
In 4th century BC Athens, the philosopher Plato tried to define the basic parts of human nature.
Let me speak briefly about the nature of the soul by using an image. And let the image have 3 parts: a pair of winged horses and a charioteer. One of the horses is of noble breed, the other ignoble. And the charioteer controls them with great difficulty. The vicious steed, when it has not been thoroughly trained, goes heavily, weighing down the charioteer to the earth. Above them, in the heaven above him, there abides the true reality with which real knowledge is concerned. The forms, which are visible only to the mind and have no color, shape, or likeness. The souls that are most like gods are carried up there by their charioteer, although troubled by their steeds, and only with difficulty beholding the true being. Other souls rise only to fall again, barely glimpsing, and then altogether failing to see because their steeds are too unruly.
Plato thinks that a human being is essentially the human being's soul. So the body is more something that the soul resides in. And he considers the soul to be composed of 3 parts. There's the rational part, there's the emotional or spirited part, the part which feels anger, and the appetitive part, which gives us our basic appetites for food, drink, sex. Human excellence is to be achieved. Where these 3 parts work together efficiently and cooperatively. And Plato says that can only happen where the rational part is ruling the soul.
I think the problem with this whole picture is, if reason is seen as human, then of course we, the whole person, will identify with the rational part. If you think you're a chariot and there's a charioteer and 2 horses, then you'll think the real you is the charioteer, of course. The real you is the little human in you. And what I think is a bit suspicious is the fact that parts of us are seen as animals, but it's not
It's not that we're not going to have passions. It's that we're going to have passions in the right way. We're going to deal with our passions in the right way. We're going to give them expression where appropriate. Same with appetites. Plato's not recommending a kind of ascetic life of repetitive denial. It's a matter of feeding our appetites, allowing our appetites their satiation in the appropriate way, at the appropriate times, with the appropriate objects.
Plato is similar to Aristotle. That
Plato's student Aristotle agreed with Plato's analysis of human nature. But he also took a broader view and asked how humans fit into nature as a whole. In Aristotle's view, everything has its own unique purpose, or in the Greek word, telos.
Surely, just as each part of man, the eye, the hand, the foot, has a purpose, so also man as a whole must have a purpose. What is this purpose? Our biological purpose we share in common even with plants. So these cannot be the purpose or function of man, since we are looking for something specific to man. The activities of our senses we also plainly share with other things, horses, cattle, and other animals. So there remains only the activities that belong to the rational part of man. The specific purpose or function of man involves the activities of that part of his soul that belongs to reason.
Suppose you were Aristotle, living 400 years before Christ. Many centuries before the emergence of modern science. You look around and you try to understand what the world is like. You ask questions to yourself about why things are the way they are. And you ask, why does it rain? It's mysterious. This water just falls from the sky. You don't know how the water gets there. You don't know what principles account for its falling. You don't know why it falls here rather than there. You don't know why the rain fell yesterday rather than today. It's all just a complete mystery. And you try to think of some explanation that would answer a question like this. Why does it rain? Aristotle was a smart guy. Aristotle was smarter than me and you and anybody that's going to see this program. And Aristotle came up with this answer. He says, basically, the rain falls so that the plants can grow. The world is a system of interlocking purposes. So the rain falls because if there were no rain, the plants would dry up and die. Well, why are there plants? Plants provide food for the animals. Why are there animals? The animals provide food for us, and their skins are useful as clothing and for other purposes. Why do we exist?
The specific purpose or function of man involves the activities of that part of his soul that belongs to reason.
Mental abilities are just different in kind from anything else you see in nature. So it's the exercise of our mental abilities that must be our purpose, Aristotle thought.
The belief that humans are superior to animals is also central to the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the book of Genesis, on the sixth day of creation, with earth, sea, the heavens, and everything else in place,
God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and every living thing that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth.
in what sense are humans made in the image of God?
The way in which the early Christians answered that question is by drawing upon Greek philosophy. Plato had earlier said that and Aristotle had repeated after him, that reason in man is godlike, is divine, that reason is the most divine aspect of our nature. And so the Christians took those notions and wove them into their understanding of human beings.
Other important dimensions of human nature are revealed in the story of the fall, also in Genesis. God forbids Adam and Eve only one thing, to eat fruit from the tree of knowledge. But the serpent tempts Eve. She eats the fruit and shares it with Adam.
Very nice.
Because of that story, early Christianity comes to believe that there is in us the marks of the punishment that God exacted from us in that garden.
Those marks of punishment became known as original sin and are closely tied to another aspect of human nature, free will.
If you look at the Greeks and read Plato and Aristotle, you do see some discussions of choice, but you don't see will being given the central place in human nature that it acquires once Christianity comes on the scene, in large part because of their reading of this fundamental choice that is made in the Garden of Eden.
In Plato, reason must struggle to control our passions and appetites. In the Christian tradition, spirit wars with flesh to control our free will. No one portrays this war more vividly than the 4th century church father St. Augustine. To show how deeply sin is embedded in human nature, he tells a story from his youth.
Near our vineyard there was a pear tree loaded with fruit. I and some other wretched youths conceived the idea of shaking the pears off this tree and carrying them away. We set out late at night and stole all the fruit that we could carry, and this was not to feed ourselves. We may have tasted a few, but then we threw the rest to the pigs. Our real pleasure was simply in doing something that was not allowed. I did evil for nothing, with no reason for wrongdoing except the wrongdoing itself. I loved the sin, not the thing for which I had committed the sin, but the sin itself.
The writings of Plato influenced Christianity almost from its beginning. Aristotle's writings were not translated into Latin and widely read until the 13th century. One of the first to pick up his ideas was St. Thomas Aquinas. For Aquinas, as for Aristotle, human nature is defined by our special purpose or goal.
And we saw Aquinas in the design of
What Aquinas added to this picture that was not present in Aristotle is the notion that this goal was put there by God. It's a creator God who makes things, designs things in such a way as to be oriented to the goals that it has. The goal-oriented nature, then, of all things, according to Aquinas, is there because of the way in which God has designed the universe.
The celestial bodies cause the generation of all things here below. So the purpose of their motion is the generation of things below. Now here below, the simplest elements exist for the sake of compound minerals. These latter exist for the sake of living bodies, among which plants exist for animals and animals for humans. So, humans are the purpose of the whole order of generation. Now humans naturally desire, as their ultimate purpose, to know the first cause of things. But the first cause of all things is God. So, the ultimate purpose of humans is to know God.
The ideas about human nature that have come down to us through the Greek and Christian traditions feel familiar and comfortable. But they can pose problems. Feminists point out that reason is often seen as a masculine trait. Women are seen as creatures of emotion, or worse yet, symbols of the temptations of the flesh. Other critics point out that people in power have often claimed that their natural superiority justifies domination over others. Rome, the Crusades, colonialism, slavery, instances in which people of reason felt compelled to civilize barbarians. This pattern comes out even in Plato's story of the charioteer.
And the chief trouble about Plato's three-part division of the soul is that it's got to do two jobs. It was designed to do two jobs, the psychological part and the political part. And he's got to get the psychological story to fit the political story. And the idea is that the rational part corresponds to the ruling class, the spirited part belongs to the military class, and the desiring part belongs to the worker. And the trouble about this is the obvious one. It gives rise to an authoritarian politics.
For Aristotle, reason defined human nature, but it wasn't given out equally.
He believed that women were intellectually and ethically inferior to men. And his modern defenders wave that aside and they say, well, that's just a mistake that he happened to make. Well, it's a rather big mistake to make. I mean, it shows how much the thing is ridden by the local conventions. He defended slavery in a way, which is, I mean, actually, most of the Greeks didn't. Most Greeks thought that slavery wasn't just. They thought it was necessary. He went out of the way to try and show it was just.
The most powerful challenge to the traditional Western view of human nature has come from biology.
In a previous, not exactly pre-Darwinian, but we'll call it pre-French Revolution era, what we now think of as the life sciences were primarily interested in classification. That's what Linnaeus gave us, the classification we still use with adaptations today. You laid out living things on a great table. Literally, you had these collectors who had tables of butterflies and things. And metaphorically, you had these tables in books which would classify all the species.
The species were eternal. They didn't have births. They didn't develop. One thing didn't turn into another.
One of the consequences of European imperial expansion and a fascination with collecting specimens was that, as well as bringing back live specimens, people also brought back dead specimens. In Paris and London, the docks of the Thames or of the Seine would be filled with crates of mammoths which were being unloaded. And here was a problem. I mean, here was a species which didn't exist, and it wasn't some kind of obscure little beetle. which we couldn't really tell. Here was something absolutely massive, and this was when one of these ships came in. It was a big social occasion. People would go down and see these big bones being taken off, and people had to rethink, what is a species? And begin to think, well, maybe species can just die out. Species aren't flat, they're historical. And that happened before Darwin was born.
It would be Charles Darwin, though, who put the pieces together, creating a new picture of nature, a picture that forced us to look again at our views of human nature. In the 1830s, Darwin traveled to the Galapagos Islands to research both living species and fossils. He observed striking patterns, subtle differences among life forms on different islands, larger differences but also clear connections to species on mainland South America 600 miles away.
As more individuals are produced than can possibly survive, there must in every case be a struggle for existence. Can we doubt that individuals that have an advantage over others would have the best chance of surviving and of procreating their kind? Take the case of a wolf, which preys on various animals. The swiftest and slimmest wolves would have the best chance of surviving, and so be preserved or selected. This preservation of favorable individual differences and the destruction of those which are injurious, I have called natural selection, or the survival of the fittest.
And that simple ratchet will reiterate and reiterate and reiterate over time, and this gradual process will improve design in myriad ways. And that's the basic idea of natural selection. There's differential reproduction. And some, which is the same as to say there's a selective pressure of some sort, so that not all offspring are created equal. And that's enough to set the process going.
Before Darwin, it was reasonable to believe that human beings were radically different from, set apart from, the rest of creation. According to Darwin, human beings are not created specially by God in his own image. Human beings have evolved by the same processes that govern the evolution of the rest of the biological world. Man is the rational animal in the traditional formulation. Darwin specifically denied that. Yes, human beings are rational, but so are other animals. The only difference is a matter of degree, not of kind.
Evolutionarily speaking, the basic design of primate brains has been a design that's been around for many millions of years, and we have many small modifications or variations on that basic theme, of which the human brain is but one.
What we are is very highly evolved creatures which are related to every other living thing on this planet. And what we are is a huge assembly of cells, more than 1 trillion in each one of us. And each of those cells is the daughter or granddaughter or great-granddaughter of another cell. And this goes back, ultimately, billions of years to the first replicators on this planet. So if you want to understand what we are, you have to go back to the beginning of life on Earth and realize that right from the outset, there were these very simple little robotic molecules, really, very complicated molecules that could reproduce themselves. And they didn't know any better, they didn't know what they were doing, they didn't care, but they could reproduce, and some of them could reproduce better than others. And that was the key.
If all creatures evolve through a struggle to survive and reproduce, what becomes of Aristotle's and Aquinas' notion that everything in nature has a special telos or purpose?
Darwin gave us a new model of explanation. Prior to Darwin, you would have said, for example, the fish has the shape that it has in order to enable it to swim in water. But what we now say is, look, there's a mechanical explanation. There's a genetic, a DNA explanation of why the fish has that shape. But, and now this is the second level of explanation, fish that have that shape are more likely to survive in water than fish that don't. A fish that's the shape of a brick isn't going to do as well in water as a fish that has a fishy shape to it.
So Aristotle would say that telos comes first. It is the source. It is the goal to which all being strives. And after Darwin, we say no. Telos comes later. It is itself a creation of a process which itself has no telos.
And I think in a few sentences he really gets out the traditional Darwinian view of evolution as a process that is not directed at any end. But before I look at the PowerPoint on Hume, I just want to point out in part of the assigned pages on page 68, your author says that, and this is a point of view called theistic evolution, the view that we can reconcile belief in God as designer and creator with the view that evolution happened and the Earth is not just 6,000 years old. For evolution need not deny the argument from design. It only changes the argument from the traditional idea that God created the universe all at once. And Hume hits at this idea, although even in Genesis he spread it out over several days, to the idea that he created it over a long period using natural selection as one of his tools. So you can say, well, there is design. It's not a random process, And theistic evolutionists disagree as to how much divine intervention, they think that there was. In other words, some theistic evolutionists hold that God was just the creator of the initial situation, and then all subsequent development was by means of Darwinian natural selection. Others hold that there were some interventions along the way, because there are gaps in the fossil record, and one of the ways of interpreting things is that God intervened in the process along the way. But anyway, David Hume, one of the three things he wanted to be remembered for in his whole life was his argument against the design proof for God. That's how important he thought it was. This argument appeared after Hume's death in a book of his called called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, Natural Theology. And it's written in dialogue form just like Plato's dialogues were. Most works in philosophy are not in dialogue form, but Hume chose that way of doing it. Now again, these pages do not correspond to pages in your text. I use a different text. I was reviewing some of the, going over some of the essays on the allegory of the cave, especially from the section 1, the 10 o'clock section. And I was very happy to see that before answering and giving their own opinion, they summarize the allegory of the cave, at least in various degrees. And we said when we went over writing that this was often a good thing to do if you're writing on someone. And so this is what Hume does. Now, there are three characters in the dialogue. Hume is the skeptical philosopher, Philo, Philo. Cleanthes is kind of the deist. He is not really crazy about taking something like the Bible at total face value. He would like to have a more rationally based and rationally defensible faith using things like the design argument. But nonetheless, he still conceives of God as having human-like qualities. And the name Cleanthes is really a composite artificial name that Hume made up, putting together hoanthropos, the word for man or human beings, right? Anthropology is the study of man or human beings, with theos, the word for God. So Cleanthes is somebody who believes that God has human-like properties, but he puts a lot of stock in things like the design argument. And then there's another character, Damio, that we'll look at, who's more or less your fundamentalist believer, fairly simple. So Hume has this character, Cleanthes, summarize the design argument, that the world is like a machine subdivided into an infinite number of smaller machines, but all machines and their parts admirably and accurately are adjusted to one another. In other words, that things in nature like the eye and the ear, as Paley later says, have parts that work together just like the parts of a watch. So throughout nature means, that is, the parts, the workings of things like eyes and ears and other things in animals and plants are adapted to ends, to purposes, in ways that resemble yet exceed the products of human design. So the conclusion then of the design argument is that the maker of and designer of the universe is much like human beings in being an intelligence. And this is portrayed and has been traditionally portrayed as what logicians call an argument from analogy. What you do when you argue something from analogy is you say, well, here are two things, A and B, and they are alike in respects 1 and 2. So, and those are your premises. That's where your argument gets started. Then you say, probably they will also be alike in some further respect. Call it respect 3. And so you see this in Paley, right? He says, well, look, here's something, a watch. It's like the eye, in the respect of having parts that I used to be able to speak the English language fluently, that integrally work together to fulfill a function or purpose, right? The wheels of the old tick-tock type watch that would have been around in Paley's day in the early 1800s, work together to enable it to fulfill the function of being a timepiece, enabling us to use it to tell time. Similarly, something like the eye or the ear has parts that work together to enable it to fulfill a function or purpose. So those are the similarities you point out in your premises, but then you say, well, but maybe then the watch is like the eye in the further respect that the watch didn't just get here. That's what Paley said is the difference between the watch and the stone. But it had to be designed by an intelligence to have those parts work together to fulfill that function. And so you can say, well, what about things in nature like eyes and ears? If they are similar in having parts that work together to fulfill a function or purpose, why wouldn't they need an intelligent designer? So you can say the effects, the products of design resemble each other. That is something like an ear resembles the product of human design like a watch. So by analogy, the causes must resemble each other also. That is, the author of nature must be an intelligence like human intelligence, a mind. And also, since the works of nature are much more complex than a simple item like a tick-tock watch, we can say, well, the designer of the products of nature must have, as Hume puts it, larger faculties. That is, the divine mind must be much more and much greater than the human mind. You know, must have larger faculties, since the products of divine design, like eyes and ears, are grander than the products of human design, like watches. So the conclusion then is that God not only exists, but that God has an intelligence similar to human intelligence, right? So that's Cleanthes. So this is not Hume advocating the design argument, but he's having the character Cleanthes summarize the argument, right? Now, we're not going to spend much time on this slide, but Damia, Damia is kind of a very simple, straightforward, fundamentalist type believer. He doesn't like it that this is an a posteriori argument, an argument based on observations about the world. He likes something, and as such, it's only a probable argument. Arguments from design are called inductive arguments. In other words, even if the premises are true, they only show that, well, probably, you know, the eye and the ear needed a designer just like the watch needed a designer. Whereas something like the ontological argument is supposed to show its conclusion with absolute mathematical certainty. Remember, it was a contradiction to accept the premises of the ontological argument and deny the conclusion. And that's the characteristic of an airtight deductive a priori argument, which is what Damia would prefer. However, Philo, the character, we only have a couple of minutes, the character that represents Hume, his quibble with the design argument is not that it's a probabilistic argument, but that he doesn't think it's a good argument from analogy. Hume says we have lots of cases where things and events resemble one another. In other words, when I strike a match, I expect it to behave much like matches always behave when you strike them, right? He says a case like that a stone's going to fall, that it's going to, if you drop it, or roll downhill, that fire will burn, that the earth is solid. I mean, he says we have thousands of similar observations to base our analogical arguments on. In other words, if I light a match, I don't put my finger over it, you know, because I think if it can burn me in the past, it can burn me now. So he says the exact similarity of these cases assures us that we're on good ground in an argument from analogy. But basically, he says, one, we only have one example of the universe, right? That's the present universe. So it isn't like we have multiple examples of design to look at. He says we have only one universe, namely this universe. But he says this may also be a weak analogy because in the design argument, to use contemporary slang, we're comparing apples with oranges. We're not comparing apples with apples. We're comparing dissimilar things. And just real quickly, he says, if you depart from the similarity of the cases you're comparing in an argument from analogy, your argument becomes much weaker. And he gives, as an example, the circulation of blood. I'm just going to go through these real quick because you can pretty much see what's going on here. He says you'd have a real strong argument arguing that blood circulates in another human being the way it does in your body because you're comparing very similar things. Likewise, even if you take an animal like a frog, you're still, if you're saying, well, analogically, blood circulates in a frog much the way it does in a human being and vice versa. But Hume says, suppose you took very dissimilar things. We look out the window and we see the trees have no leaves on them, right? And yet vegetables and trees have little tubules within them where sap goes, just like veins, that can, in other words, there are tubules in plants and trees that conduct sap much the way veins do. But Hume says these are very dissimilar, and it would be wrong to conclude that sap circulates in a tree the way it does in the way blood does. So you'd come to a wrong conclusion using dissimilar cases. We know in the winter the sap goes down to the roots, and that's why we get the leaves dropping off and everything. Okay, I don't want to make you late for your next class. If you miss the roll or somebody bring up the roll if they have it. Did I not pass it out? I thought, I think I started filling it out. Oh, I'm sorry. I started filling it out, and then another person interrupted me with a test. So here, I'll leave a pen here. Just sign it on the way out then. Thank you, and we'll see you next time. We're going to finish this up. This is only going to take part of the period, and then look at Descartes.